Okay, welcome everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to our first webinar of the new year. We're super excited to team up with the UW Center for Cooperatives this afternoon to get a preview of the results of the very first Cooperative Governance Research Initiative survey. This survey is already yielding some really insightful data. We're so excited to see the interest in this data and we're excited that you're here today to dig a little bit deeper into that. So thank you for joining us. My name is Liz, and I'm going to run through just a couple housekeeping items here before we get started. So today's webinar is going to run for 60 minutes, and toward the end of that, we'll have time for Q&A. So we do encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar. Please use the Q&A box. You're also welcome to use the chat box to comment and be part of the conversation this afternoon. Our team will be monitoring that conversation and we'll do our best to get to as many of your questions as possible during that Q&A session toward the end. So feel free to be as engaged as you'd like to be. So to get us started this afternoon, I am going to hand things over to Courtney Berner, the Executive Director of the UW Center for Cooperatives. Welcome, Courtney.
Thank you so much, Liz, and welcome to everyone joining us on this webinar. We had almost 350 people register, which is really exciting to our team to see that there's so much interest in this project that we've been working on so hard over the last year. So before we get started, I just want to share sort of our three goals for our time together this afternoon. The first is really to celebrate and recognize the many, many people who have contributed to this project so far. The second is to showcase the breadth of data that we have been able to collect through the survey. And then the third is to share out some top level findings. I just want to emphasize that we're at the early stages of analysis at this point. We just closed the survey in December, but we're already seeing some really interesting and suggestive patterns that we plan to talk through today, and we look forward to exploring in a deeper way as we continue to analyze the survey data and do our interviews. All right, next slide, please. So before we dive into the data, I want to take a step back. What do we mean by governance? Governance is the way that a nation or a company is controlled and how decisions are made. So as most of you likely know, cooperatives have a unique structure, a unique governance structure that reflects the fact that they are owned and controlled by their members. So in the case, can you go back to the other slide, please? Sorry. So in the case of cooperatives, governance refers to the structures and processes by which members control their cooperative and participate in decision making. So Johnston Birchall, an academic, uses a cake metaphor to sort of as a framework for thinking about governance in cooperatives. And he asserts that good cooperative governance has three core elements. The first is member involvement. Second is representation, and the third is expertise. So no two cooperatives cut the cake in exactly the same way in terms of prioritizing those three elements of good governance. Some assume that representatives who are elected will have the necessary expertise, so they cut a very large slice for representation. Some do the opposite. They might have a nominations process that's fairly tight to ensure that only people with the right expertise are elected to the board, in which case they are choosing to cut a larger slice for expertise and potentially neglecting the representative function. There's no perfect ratio here, but Birchall asserts that cooperatives should make a deliberate attempt to balance these three elements. All right, next slide, please. All right, so let's talk about the Cooperative Governance Research Initiative, which is affectionately referred to as Cougary on our team, and that's how we'll be referring to it today, since that's the way we call it here. So Cougary. As you all know, democratic member control is really one of the things that all cooperatives, credit unions, and insurance mutuals share. It is also one of the things that makes these businesses unique from other forms of enterprise. I like to say that democratic member control is the cooperative community's superpower, but it is also our Achilles heel. And decades of research has shown that strong governance is essential for cooperatives to thrive. It's correlated with performance, it's essential for addressing members' needs, and it's really fundamental to the cooperative DNA. Unfortunately, cooperatives currently lack the robust data that is needed to benchmark, reflect upon, and improve their governance practices. So in the cooperative spirit, we created Cougary, we launched Cougary to really address an unmet need that we saw for robust governance data across cooperative sectors and over time. And we feel like this project really exemplifies the UW Center for Cooperatives' commitment to doing research that is both academically rigorous and valued by the cooperative community. Next slide, please. So Laura and I developed two key research questions that have guided this project so far and really guided our approach to the survey. So the first is, what is the scope and prevalence of governance practices across the cooperative community related to a number of factors? I won't read them all, but those are the key things that we looked at in the survey. And then secondly, where are the most opportune areas to advance cooperatives practices in these areas? So these questions guided how we developed the survey, and they will continue to guide how we conduct our analysis and engage in interviews later in the project. All right, next slide, please. From the outset of the project, it was really important to me to have stakeholders from the cooperative community involved. So before I even sought funding for the project, I had conversations with leaders from most of the organizations listed on this slide to make sure that there was buy-in from the co-op community and really a desire to have access to this kind of data. Those conversations were very positive, so we decided to move forward. I'd like to take a minute now just to express my deep appreciation to every member of the Cougary Advisory Committee for the many ways that they contributed to the success of this project and continue to contribute. They reviewed the survey instrument, they helped build the sampling frame, they promoted the survey to their members and clients, and they were a sounding board for Laura and me throughout the project. Really, they exemplify sort of this participatory research approach that we've been trying to take and have been a critical part of the success of the project. I would also like to thank several other people who are not on the committee, but have provided support in one way or another. Of course, I'd like to thank our funders. I'd like to thank the NCBA team for hosting this webinar. I'd like to thank the UW Survey Center and all of our pre-testers who helped us polish the survey instrument before it went out to the big list. I want to thank our UWCC team members. Our team collectively made over like 400 or 500 follow-up phone calls when the survey was in the field. I also want to thank the admin staff from the Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics for their help navigating UW bureaucracy. And then of course, I want to thank our survey participants. Without people taking the survey, we wouldn't have any data to be reporting back on today. So a huge thanks to those of you who took the time to complete our survey. All right, next slide. So in addition to sharing some preliminary findings today, we also see this webinar as an opportunity to gather feedback from all of you about how we can continue to shape this research in a way that is most beneficial to the cooperative community. So as we move through the rest of the webinar, we hope you will chime in with answers to these questions. You know, what preliminary findings are most interesting to you? Where should we dive deeper in the interviews? And what kinds of tools and resources would be useful for you or for your cooperative? So as you're moving through the webinar, please keep these questions in mind. Feel free to chime in the chat. We'll be saving the chat and looking back at it after this webinar. So your input really will matter. And if you have questions though, please put those in the Q&A function. So now I will turn it over to Laura to explain our methods and to provide an overview of our survey respondents.
All right, thank you so much, Courtney. Could you do the next slide, please? Thank you. My name is Laura Hanson Schlachter. I'm a researcher at the UW Center for Cooperatives, and I joined the team really primarily to work on Cougary. And so it's really been a team effort. I feel so grateful to be a part of it and to everyone who has contributed to a successful launch. So thank you. Now, there are three key methodological and I would say really philosophical aspects of our approach to this research. As Courtney said, the first is really our commitment to participatory research methods. As she said, our advisory committee members have been instrumental in ensuring that our research questions are really rooted in the needs of cooperators on the ground. And Cougary has also enabled the UW Center for Cooperatives to really build on our experience conducting participatory research. And looking forward, for us, it represents a prime opportunity to advance one of our strategic goals, which is to more intentionally integrate our research portfolio with our outreach, education, and co-op development efforts. The second key aspect of our approach is pairing that focus on real-world needs with academic rigor and mixed methods. We really want this data to be relevant and robust so that it can contribute to conversations among scholars just as easily as conversations between cooperative colleagues. And one strategy for us to achieve that is by using mixed methods, meaning that we are triangulating survey responses, which allow us to compare broad trends within and across co-ops from different industries of different types, sizes, geographies, and bringing those survey data together with interview data. Interviews really allow us to explore the social processes underlying those aggregate trends by inviting cooperatives to share their experiences with governance in their own words. Another part of our methods is to collect data every 2 years. We're interested in examining patterns over time. So the first survey took place in 2021. It'll next take place in 2023 and in odd numbered years thereafter. And we've also done our best to utilize best practices. For example, we contracted experts at the University of Wisconsin Survey Center to help us polish the questionnaire. They're also working with us to finalize our weighting and our sampling strategy. And then the third aspect of our approach is, again, that commitment to what we call translational research, meaning that we plan to leverage findings from Cougary to develop practical evidence-based tools for cooperatives of all kinds. Next slide, please. All right, now I'm happy to get more into the methodological weeds in the Q&A, but for now, I'll just say a few words about the survey itself and our sampling strategy. So as I said, this is a firm level survey of key informants, meaning that we invited one person responsible for the governance function of their cooperative to complete the survey on behalf of their organization. And of course, we recognize that one person can't possibly speak for all of their colleagues. So we really focused on behavioral measures, i.e. like whether or not cooperatives have specific governance practices, with just a few attitudinal items and open response questions, which really are trying to get at personal views and perspectives. We targeted CEOs and general managers because we thought that people in these roles would be knowledgeable about governance issues, and about 75% of our respondents were a CEO or a general manager. The survey took about 30 minutes to complete. So again, thank you to all of our participants. We know that's a really big ask and we really appreciate your time. And it was open between October and December of 2021. So we wrapped up data collection just before the holidays. And if you're curious, the full questionnaire is publicly available. It's online on our website. In terms of our sampling strategy, unfortunately, there's no master list of all CEOs and general managers of all co-ops in the US. So we had to create one ourselves. And again, we're grateful to our advisory committee members, most of whom shared their member client lists, again, knowing that the survey is confidential, no individual cooperative will be identifiable in the final results. And you'll see that in the way that we're presenting data here. Now, since this is the first wave of data collection, and we know there's still work to do building out that list, for 2021, we selected all co-ops with certainty except for credit unions. For those, we did pull a stratified random sample based on asset size. I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. But ultimately, this left us with a sample of about 4,400 cooperatives, insurance mutuals, and credit unions. We're still crunching the numbers on our response rate, following best practices from the American Association for Public Opinion Research, but all of those details will be in the final report. And on that note, one of the people helping us calculate our response rate, do our non-response bias, is Ethan Cook. He's a senior computer science major at UW-Madison, and we really appreciate all of his work helping us out with this project. All right, next slide, please. So I just want to share with you a little bit about the cooperatives that participated in the survey. So we received 502 usable surveys in total, which is fantastic. That far exceeded my wildest hopes and dreams for the launch year of this survey. We're defining here a usable survey as it includes some all complete and then some partial responses. Basically, a partial response for us means that the co-op answered all of the crucial questions in the instrument. All of those were grouped in the first third of the survey intentionally. And our item response analysis so far shows that most people who did complete the survey filled out most of the questions. So we have very few skipped questions, especially relative to kind of a typical survey. In terms of generalizability, I want to really emphasize here that the results we're presenting today are not weighted. Again, I'll say that the results we're presenting today are not weighted, and the characteristics of respondents do not necessarily mirror those of all cooperatives we invited to participate, much less all co-ops in the US. Okay, so everything we're presenting today is kind of the raw distributions from respondents. Later in the analysis process, we'll be able to get to the point where we can see how well do our findings generalize to all cooperatives in the US. Okay, so we're still determining how and whether to weight the data. Again, we're working with a survey statistician at the UW Survey Center, but either way, the final report will include a really deep dive on non-response bias. For example, are certain kinds of cooperatives in certain states more likely to participate than others? Given our outreach effort and our relationships at the UW Center for Cooperatives and kind of my preliminary analysis, for example, of geography, I suspect that cooperatives in Wisconsin are probably overrepresented in the data. So some of that is to be determined, but one thing I can say with confidence at this point is that we've done a really good job with our goal to capture as much variation and diversity in the cooperative community as possible. So you can see on this slide, in terms of type, the vast majority, about 95% of participating cooperatives are primary co-ops of individual members. We do have a few secondary and hybrid co-ops in the mix though. About half of our respondents are consumer cooperatives, and then insurance mutuals, producer co-ops, and worker co-ops represent about 15% of respondents each. Next slide, please. In terms of industry, you can see here that financial services, this includes credit unions, farm credit, and retail, which is grocery and also other types of cooperatives, represent about a quarter of respondents each. And then agriculture, insurance, and other types of cooperatives combined represent another quarter. So again, some pretty good industry representation here. Next slide, please. And then in terms of some other key firm characteristics that we know matter for governance, respondents are headquartered in at least 34 different states, 10% converted from a non-cooperative business form, 9% had merged with another cooperative in the past 5 years. And we looked at size in a number of different ways, but in terms of members, we also had a lot of diversity. Some of the participants are very small worker cooperatives with only a handful of worker owners and really no distinction between members of the cooperative and the board. Others had, millions of members and multiple layers of governance, of representative governance. And in terms of membership, survey respondents really range widely in size from 4 to millions of members. And then in terms of age, again, respondents kind of run the gamut. We've got co-ops that have been operating since the mid 1800s and those that launched just last year. So we're really pleased by that variation in the data. And next, Courtney is going to dive into some of our key takeaways.
Thanks, Laura. All right, so before we do that, I just want to revisit these research questions since they provide a good roadmap for what we'll be walking through over the next section of the webinar. So again, the 8 sort of things that you see listed there under that first research questions, those really became 8 of our key constructs for the survey and the topics that we looked into with the survey. So again, just a reminder that we've done our first pass of the data, but we're still teasing out patterns. So today we'll really be offering sort of some of the most interesting tidbits from each of these 8 areas. In some cases, it will be data on specific practices, and in others, it will be some more of those attitudinal questions that Laura referred to earlier. All right, next slide. So we'll start with board composition and qualifications. So participating co-ops represent substantial diversity in terms of board structure, board size, and the characteristics of directors. About 9% of the respondents practice direct democracy, meaning that the entire membership serves on the board of directors. And so among those, among the Cougary respondents, the vast majority of co-ops with direct democracy are worker co-ops. So it's was not hugely surprising. There were a couple of consumer co-ops in there and a couple of other types of co-ops, but most of the cooperatives that use direct democracy are worker owned. The unique dynamics of direct democracy could and likely will be a research agenda unto itself. So we'll do a deeper dive into like what do those co-ops have in common? What can we learn about co-ops that are using direct democracy? But we'll save that for another day. Since the majority of participating co-ops practice representative democracy or practice democracy in which they elect a board of directors from the membership to serve, the remaining data that we will present during this webinar will just be responses from co-ops that use representative democracy. So to reiterate, all of the data we are presenting from here forward only includes co-ops with an elected board. A lot of our questions only apply to those cooperatives. So I want to make sure that that's clear. So boards of these co-ops with representative democracy range in size from 1 to 30 directors with an average of 8 directors on the board. We also collected data on the tenure, age, gender, race, and ethnicity of board members, but we won't be reporting on that data here today. We'll do a deeper dive into that, into the board demographics in our final Cougary report. So among co-ops that practice representative democracy, we also see substantial diversity in terms of directors' roles vis-a-vis the cooperative. So 18% of respondents allow outside directors. We define an outside director as an individual who serves on the board, but is not in fact a member of the cooperative. 21% of respondents allow the CEO to serve on the board, and 24% allow other employees to serve on the board as well. All right, next slide, please. So in addition to asking specific questions about board composition, we asked respondents if they think their board has the right mix of people, and if the demographics of the board, of the current board, mirror the members of the co-op overall. So, or if the demographics of the current board members mirror those of the membership overall. So 61% of respondents are very or extremely confident that the board has the right mix of people to perform its governance duties effectively. When you move over to that question about demographics and how well the board members mirror the demographics of the membership overall, that drops to 49%. So 49% of respondents feel that the demographics of current board members mirror those of the membership overall, either very or extremely well. And then 44% of respondents said their cooperative is either very or extremely likely to pursue goals related to increasing board diversity in the next 3 years. And one of the follow-up questions we had was what sort of dimensions of diversity are they interested in exploring or increasing? And again, we're not going to report on that here, but that will be in the final report. All right, next slide, please. So the next area of inquiry is related to board nominations and elections. So we found that members directly elect the board in the vast majority of participating co-ops. So 96% of participating co-ops reported that the members elect the board directly. But there are some co-ops where delegates or current board members actually elect new directors. We had a series of questions on proxy voting, and proxy voting allows members of a cooperative to delegate their voting power to a representative. And approximately 1/5 of the respondents allow proxy voting. This practice is relatively more common among consumer cooperatives and insurance mutuals. We'll be doing a presentation for the National Association of Mutual Insurance Companies, NAMIC, on May 11th, and we'll do a much deeper dive into proxies there if you're interested. So many of our questions were about nominations. You might have noted that earlier in the webinar, in that cake metaphor, we talk about the trade-offs that co-ops have to make between representation, member voice, and expertise. And so one of the Trends that was interesting is that a lot of cooperatives, a large majority of them, respondents in this case, 71%, have a board committee that is responsible for the nominations process. And in the majority of cases, 68%, nominating committee members are selected by the board. Only 4% of respondents reported that nominating committee members were elected by the broader co-op membership. So it seems to be that a large number of co-ops are really prioritizing for expertise. We have a lot more questions that we won't get into today about sort of the structure of the nominating committee and what they are tasked with, what they're responsible for. So a lot to unpack there that I think will be really interesting. The most common board recruitment strategy was identifying candidates through professional or personal networks of current directors. So 82% of respondents indicated that was a strategy they used to attract new board candidates. In terms of term limits and consecutive terms, only 14% of respondents limit the number of consecutive terms a board member may serve, and only 8% have limits on the total number of terms a board member may serve. In co-ops, sometimes you can serve 6 or 3 consecutive terms, then you have to take a year off. But often there's no limits on the total number of terms you can serve over the course of your life. And then 90% of respondents do not have a mandated retirement age for board members. All right, next slide, please. The data we collected on contested elections was also pretty interesting. For the purposes of this survey, we defined a contested election as one in which the number of candidates exceeds the number of open board seats. And we found that 59% of respondents have not had a contested board election in the past 3 years. So certainly more to dive into there as we get into the analysis. All right, next slide, please. So next up is board training, education, and development. So we asked about a wide range of practices in this section, including onboarding new directors, the training that the full board receives, board evaluation, sort of who gets evaluated, how often are those evaluations conducted. And then we asked about processes for removing underperforming directors or directors who are not fulfilling their board responsibilities adequately. So large majorities of respondents train board members on fiduciary duties, financial topics, the cooperative sort of model, principles, values in general, and ethics and compliance. So over 80% of all respondents said that they offered their directors training in those areas. Training in legal and regulatory issues and conflict resolution and meeting facilitation were relatively less common. It'll be interesting as we dive into the data more deeply, sort of understanding how co-ops of different sizes, ages, industries prioritize different types of training for their boards. In terms of one tidbit from the onboarding questions that we asked, 26% of co-ops or respondents match incoming directors with a board mentor. So that's one of the practices used by about a quarter of co-ops to help bring new directors up to speed. 59% of co-ops have a formal process for removing underperforming members, board members, or those who have failed to meet their board obligations. And of those, 15% or about 40 co-ops have removed a board member for underperforming or failing to meet their board obligations in the last 5 years. All right, next slide, please. So in terms of conducting board evaluations, and just a reminder again that these are, this data includes co-ops that use representative democracy. Just over a quarter of respondents conduct an annual board evaluation, but almost half of respondents, or 47%, indicated that they had never evaluated the board as a whole. An opportunity for improvement. All right, next slide. So the last one for me, I'll talk a bit about board meetings and decision-making practices. As you all likely know, most of our board work, a lot of our board work happens in board meetings. And while those board meetings may have shifted to an online format in the last couple of years, that's still where most decisions are made and most dynamics between board members sort of emerge. So we had several questions about board meetings and how boards go about, making decisions as a group. So in 33% of the responding co-ops, the CEO and the board chair jointly set the agenda for board meetings. In 15% of co-ops, CEOs or the general manager, we're using those terms interchangeably here, set the agenda alone with no input from the board chair. So while the CEO is involved in setting the agenda in a large percentage of co-ops, the board chair is still typically facilitating board meetings. So 72% of respondents indicated that the board chair typically facilitates meetings. And then we also asked about executive sessions. And so one tidbit from those questions, 24% of respondents spend time in executive session, and we define an executive session as a meeting that just includes the board members. So all people are excluded from the meeting except for board members. So 24% of respondents spend time in executive session in most or all of their board meetings. So most or all board meetings include at least some portion that is in executive session. And 56% of respondents include an executive session in either none or very few of their meetings in the last year. All right, next slide, please. So we also tried to ask a couple of questions to better understand both how boards are allocating their time in board meetings to different topics, but also sort of ideally how they would be allocating time to those topics. So what are you doing? Aspirationally, what do you think you should be doing? And so just one of those we pulled out, and it's about how much time is allocated to discussing strategy during board meetings. So 26% of co-ops spend most of their time on strategy, but 43% said that ideally they would spend most of their time on strategy. So we asked about several different topics, but we just pulled out strategy to talk about today. So, all right, I will now pass it off to Laura to talk about the next 4 constructs.
Thank you, Courtney. And I think you can see here, this data is so extraordinarily rich. And so again, what we've tried to do here is just pull out some things that really struck us, but stay tuned for our final report because we're going to do a much deeper dive on all of these topics. And there are lots of questions we asked about that we're not able to present on today. But one thing that we heard over and over again that from our advisory committee, from folks we talked to, is that they'd like to learn more about board compensation. And so we did have a series of questions on that topic. The first question was just, do board members receive compensation beyond expense reimbursement? And we found that a slight majority, 57%, do provide compensation to their board members. I should note that this question, unlike many others, had a relatively high item non-response. So about half of the cooperatives that completed the survey did not answer this question. We allowed and encouraged co-ops that did not feel comfortable answering certain questions to skip it. But that, I think, in and of itself is an interesting data point. We found that the average annual compensation for non-officers on the board ranges from 0, so some co-ops allow it, but they don't always do it, to $190,000. Next slide, please. We asked a series of questions to try to get at what types of compensation are most common. And as you can see here, the most common type of payments were per meeting, but contingent upon attendance. Fixed annual, quarterly, or monthly payments were also quite common. But you can see here that compensation at an hourly rate was pretty rare. Next slide, please. We had a lot of questions about the CEO or general manager. Again, we use these terms interchangeably here. The first question was just, do you have one? Because again, we have such a diverse group of cooperatives here. Some of them have quite a flat structure. But 87% of our respondents did report that they have a highest ranking employee, such as a CEO, general manager, or executive director. I should say that about 2/3 of the respondents that do not have a CEO or general manager are worker cooperatives, but we also had a few that were consumer cooperatives, producer, multi-stakeholder, or other types of cooperatives. So I think that's kind of an interesting potential arena to dive into, is kind of the structure of management in these firms. But among those that do have a CEO or general manager, 65% use industry benchmarks to determine that person's compensation. 47% have a long-term succession plan for their CEO or general manager, and 75% have a succession plan for the CEO in the case of an emergency. So you can see that that kind of emergency succession plan is much more common relatively among respondents. Next slide, please. And then this is, for me, one of the attitudinal measures, or where we're really trying to just understand people's perspectives, that I find most interesting. Now, keep in mind that 75% of the people who answered this question are the CEO or the general manager. But 59% of these people say that the board does strike an appropriate balance between supporting and challenging the CEO. So 59% say they strike that balance very or extremely well. And that's kind of a hot topic in a lot of the corporate governance literature that we want to do a deeper dive on here. Next slide, please. Now, of course, we asked a suite of questions about member participation, one of the defining features that really differentiates cooperatives from conventional firms. And there's really a lot of rich data here, but just a few high-level points that were striking to us. Email was the most common tactic to promote member participation in elections and annual member meetings. So about 76% of cooperatives used email to promote that kind of participation, followed by newsletters, about 65%, and then mailing, 63%. About 44% of respondents do not allow members who are not directors to attend regular board meetings. And then we also find that respondents use a variety of other strategies to engage members more generally, most commonly via social media, about 69%, and the co-op newsletter, about 65%. So, and then next slide, please. We also asked some questions about kind of perception of member engagement and participation, and 61% of our respondents said that they think board members understand the needs of members very or extremely well. So I think there's some interesting work to be done here analytically to kind of think through what is the kind of meaning or the interpretation of these practices and these perceptions. Next slide, please. And then the last construct we asked about was board culture. Now, in many ways, this is the hardest to examine in a firm level survey, again, because so many aspects of board culture are idiosyncratic. They're best explored in people's own words. And so we definitely want to do a deeper dive into board culture in the interviews. But that said, I think we did come up with some excellent attitudinal measures that have pretty high reliability. For example, we asked respondents to rate, how well do you think the board builds social and interpersonal dynamics that support it in its governance effectiveness? And about half said they think their board does that very or extremely well. Next slide, please. And this section of the questionnaire is really where we also concentrated our open-ended questions that asked respondents to describe and reflect on specific situations. These questions were inspired by a sociologist I really admire named Mario Small. And here's just a few examples. Basically, we asked them to think back to the last time that a particular situation happened. So think back to the last time an issue or a decision at your cooperative elicited a strong reaction from members. So we asked them to just describe that issue or decision in a few words, and then to tell us, what steps did the board of management of your cooperative take to address members' concerns, and then what was the outcome? Similarly, we asked about, think back to the last time there was a conflict between members of the board. Think back to the last time there was disagreement between the CEO and the board about the right path forward. So we're kind of posing these different situations that are quite common in cooperatives and that come up in the day-to-day of governance, and asking folks to just tell us a little bit about what happened and then how that issue was addressed or resolved. And I think these open-ended questions are another really good example of how we're bringing together that qualitative with the quantitative data to try to gain a richer picture of governance processes and dilemmas. And one thing I was really pleased about, often in surveys like this, because they're more time consuming, people will skip these open-ended questions. But on my analysis, we have quite a few very rich, people really took the time to share these stories. Again, this is all confidential, no co-op will be identified in the final results, but I just want to thank all of our survey participants who really took the time to answer these questions so thoughtfully. All right, next slide, please. So that is just a few nuggets from kind of our top 8 areas in the survey. And I just want to give you a sneak peek at what's happening next for the interviews. So speaking of kind of qualitative data, about half, so 53% of our respondents volunteered to do an interview. So that's over 250 people. Again, thank you, survey participants. I was completely blown away by this. Our goal was to do, 5 to 15 interviews. So we're kind of still working out how the logistics of that will work, but we're really excited that there's so much enthusiasm from people to share their stories. And what we're going to do is we've got that list of everyone who volunteered. We're going to invite a purposive sample, which is basically we're going to choose a smaller group of people to share to really maximize that diversity of perspectives. And they'll be invited to a Zoom interview in February or March of this year. And this, again, our goal is to give co-ops a chance to share their experiences with governance in their own words. So interviews are our immediate next step. And next, I'll hand it back to Courtney. She's going to talk a little bit about what happens after that.
Great. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what's next for Cougary? As Laura said, we'll be doing interviews. So for those of you who've asked questions about what we've learned in the interviews, sorry, we can't answer those yet today, but stay tuned. So once those interviews are done, we will be completing our analysis of the survey and interview results this spring, so April, May. Just a teaser, one of the things we didn't touch on today is we did include several questions about cooperative performance. So we're hoping through further analysis to be able to come up with some interesting findings related to governance practices and performance. So stay tuned. We'll be publishing the final report on the first wave of data collection in June. And then really spending the rest of 2022 doing 2 things. One, raising funds to support the next wave of data collection and to support the development of some tools. And then secondly, really developing these evidence-based tools. So trying to bring the findings of this survey back to co-ops in a way that helps inform their practices and can help inform and improve governance practices across the community. So we're looping it back around in that way. And then we plan to collect data for wave 2 in the summer of 2023. So some of the tools that we've been thinking about, but this is again, why we want your input, why we want your feedback now and over the rest of this year, is, we've thought of some tools that we think will be interesting based on the data we collected, maybe a director compensation index, maybe some sort of template for board evaluation and assessment, a guide for improving board manager communication, perhaps a toolbox on improving orientation and onboarding strategies. And then hopefully we'll have enough material to maybe do a couple of case studies on highly effective member engagement strategies or some other aspect of cooperative governance. So those are some of the things that we've brainstormed. But again, we invite you into this conversation to help us develop tools, to help us leverage this data in a way that's going to be most useful to co-ops across the country. I also wanted to mention that we are going to be doing some industry-specific presentations. So Often folks are interested in like, what do you know about my specific subset of the co-op community? So we already mentioned that we'll be doing one for NAMIC, mutual insurance companies, in May. I'll be presenting next week at the National Council of Farmer Cooperatives annual meeting. So if you have an interest in organizing or hosting us for a sector or industry specific conversation, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. All right, next slide. Look at that, right on time. So for the rest of our time together, we invite you to do two things. So we're gonna shift into Q&A mode. So if you have questions and you haven't asked them already, please put them into the Q&A box. But we also want to remind you of these questions we have for you. You know, which findings are most interesting to you? Where do you think we should dive deeper in the interviews? We're in the process, we're about to start putting together our questions for the interviews. And what kinds of tools and resources would be most useful for you or your co-op? So if you have responses to those questions that we have for you, please put them into the chat and we will be poring over those after the webinar. If you have questions for us, please put them in the Q&A function. So I will bop over here to some questions. Let's see here. So I'll just take this first one. Question from Gail. I'm wondering why you chose CEOs or general managers rather than board presidents for a survey on governance practices. Great question, Gail, and one that we've been asked before. It really, in a lot of ways, it was a practical decision. It's very, very hard to track down contact information for board members of cooperatives. It's much easier to get contact information for CEOs and general managers. And that was really the practical reason. We knew that there was no one perfect person to take this survey in every co-op. And so this was one of those difficult choices we had to make. Laura, I don't know if there's anything you want to add on that.
No, I think that captures it. I mean, I'll just say, if someone out there has a list of all of the board presidents, by all means, send me an email and we will chat.
Yes, definitely. So another question here. So for outside directors, this is from Virginia, for outside directors, I'm curious if there were reasons given for why they were allowed as directors. So we did not ask that specific question. As Laura mentioned earlier, and it's in the chat and in the slides, there's a link to the survey instrument on our website. We made it publicly available as soon as we had finalized it. So really we asked more questions around, are they allowed to serve on the board? Are they allowed to vote? How many do you currently have? How are they chosen or how are they selected? So are outside directors elected by the members? Are they appointed by the board? And then is your co-op considering adding board seats for outside directors? And then if so, why? So we didn't ask the exact role that they play. Outside directors, I think, is an interesting area for further exploration in interviews. But those are the types of questions that we asked related to outside directors. Let's see here. All right, Laura, I am going to pitch this one to you. Can you talk more about the credit union participation and whether there is a subset of responses available?
Yes, so we had really strong participation from credit unions. As you saw a little bit from the by industry slide, we had 125 cooperatives that are in the financial services sector. So that includes credit unions, farm credit, and other financial services. We are able to segment out which of those are credit unions, and in the final report, we will be running some analysis within industries. And as Courtney mentioned, we're doing some industry specific presentations, for example, for mutual insurance companies. We'd be happy to put something together for credit unions. I know we're doing a couple in the ag sector. So very strong participation from credit unions, and we will be looking at some industry specific findings in financial services and in some of the other industries where we have strong representation.
Okay. Laura, do you happen to know the approximate number of credit union respondents? That was another question that someone had.
It would take me a minute to double check. So I'm happy to send you a follow. If you want to send me an email, I'm happy to send you a follow-up email with the exact number.
Question from John. Hi, John. John Penry. Are you going to report the results based on how long the cooperative has been in business? So that is one of the things that we asked, and there was a wide range, businesses, cooperatives that were established in the 1800s, and then cooperatives that were established in 2021. So wide range. I think what gets included in the final report will be influenced in part by what is interesting. So if there is something interesting that comes out of, co-ops of different ages and how, if that influenced how they completed the survey or how their governance practices have developed, then yes. But it is one of the things pieces of data that we collected. So Laura, I don't know.
Yeah,
if
well, just to
say about that.
Say, again, if you're interested in a particular dynamic or a particular kind of set of questions, let us know. There are so many different directions we could go with this data. It's so rich. One of the things we do need to be mindful of, though, is that, again, this survey was confidential. We want to make sure that no individual cooperative is identifiable in the final results. So that's something, if there's a firm characteristic that's relatively rare in the data set, we're going to make sure that we're always aggregating so that, again, we're not kind of giving away who that might be for those of you who are cooperative detectives out there.
All right, here, Laura, a question for you. Well, either of us can, but I'm going to pitch it at you. I see now you have some data on succession planning for CEOs and general managers, but what about board positions? Do we collect data on succession for board positions?
We did not collect data on succession of board positions, but we did ask how well do you think your cooperative kind of preserves institutional knowledge? And so we have, that's an attitudinal measure that gets at some of those issues. I've got to tell you that it was so hard to get this to a 30-minute survey. And one of the other things that Courtney and I have discussed as a potential in the future is really because we want to ask the same questions over time so that we can really understand those trends. But we're considering in future years potentially appending like a module on kind of a special topic, so that if we wanted to really do a deep dive, for example, on succession planning, maybe we would add 10 specific questions, but only in 1 year. And then maybe the next time, maybe we want to do a really deep dive on diversity, equity, and inclusion, or some topic that really is of interest to the community. So again, keeping our ears to the ground for what would be useful to you all.
So another question I'll pitch to you. Any information on how often and or in what ways boards gather feedback information from members? We haven't gone too deep there yet, but
we have a lot of questions in that vein in the member participation section, and that also comes up in the board culture section. And so take a look at the instrument if there are specific measures you're especially interested in, but that's going to be a big focus of the final report. There's so much there. What we wanted to do today is just sort of some teasers, but if you're interested in specific questions, once you take a look at that instrument, please let us know.
So the question, could you run this type of survey for food co-ops only? We could. We actually, the food co-op sector, like gold star to grocery co-ops, they really came out for this survey. So we don't have any plans to run the survey for specific segments of the co-op community at this point, but what we are able to do is pull data out and look to, so what I'll be doing when I'm at NCFC next week is really isolating the data that we collected from agricultural cooperatives, farmer-owned cooperatives, to try to understand sort of what's going on that might be unique to ag co-ops and how do the practices that ag co-ops are participating in sort of compare to either other specific segments of the co-op community or the broader co-op community. So we could, but we actually have very good response rate from food co-ops. So thank you.
And I'd be happy to put together something specifically for that sector, just for what it's worth.
All right, Laura. How does the CEO GM response rate, so I think by that they mean sort of the the fact that 75% of respondents were in fact the CEO or GM of the co-op. How does that impact our interpretation of the results? Will we compare GM versus board director responses, et cetera?
Yes, so I will say, so I'm a sociologist by training, and one of the kind of core tenets of my discipline is that all knowledge is socially situated. So of course, we always are thinking about kind of the positionality of the person who actually completed the survey. That's why we also asked a lot of questions, which I didn't report on here, not only about kind of the respondents' role in the cooperative, but also their tenure, some of their demographic characteristics, because we're trying to understand kind of how does someone's position like in the world and in the social hierarchy kind of how might that shape their perceptions of what's going on in their cooperative. So I do plan to do some of that analysis. It certainly won't be exhaustive, but that's also something that, you know, interviews are much better suited to kind of explore how, you know, multiple people in the same cooperative with different roles, different positions might perceive the same situation a little bit differently. So that's something I'd like to explore with the qualitative data as well.
So another question from Katie. I'm interested in the relatively low priority it seems existing folks are placing on conflict resolution training. Can you say more about that? So we didn't report on this because we were only reporting on co-ops that use representative democracy. But one of the things I noticed looking through the results before we took that out was that conflict resolution and facilitation training, actually there were a larger, like co-ops that practice direct democracy, so are smaller, all the members are on the board. They reported doing conflict resolution training and facilitation training at higher rates than the sort of co-op universe as a whole. So that was partly why I said, you know, I'm interested to dig into this and really see like how co-ops of different sizes and types are prioritizing different types of training for their directors. And some of that might have to do with really like the type of work that's being done at the board level within that cooperative.
I'll just say, I have that number handy. So 31% of co-ops that have a representative, that practice representative democracy have training on conflict resolution, but over half among co-ops that practice direct democracy, 52%.
Okay. So I'm curious, this is from Matthew Epperson. I'm curious if in terms of the open-ended responses pertaining to board or board CEO conflict that you've noticed mention of allowing staff members on the board as a source of conflict. So we haven't actually, the data that came back from those open-ended questions is like very exciting and there's so much of it. So we haven't gone there yet, but certainly that's the type of thing we'd be looking for, trying to understand and parse out sort of where is that conflict, not only how is conflict being resolved, but what are the sources of conflict. So good question. I will pitch this one to you, Laura, from Tom Wagner. Do results include responses about which type of board competencies were most important to effective board leadership?
Oh, that is a good question. Let me see if I can pull up. We do talk about kind of different kinds of diversity that is valued. I think the question, Courtney, what immediately comes to mind for me that gets the closest at that is we have that question Courtney mentioned about does your cooperative plan, how likely is your cooperative to kind of pursue goals related to board diversity in the next 3 years? And if they said, and then we had a follow-up question that asked, well, what kinds of diversity are you interested in? And we asked about, you know, not only demographic characteristics like gender, age, race, but we also asked about kind of more skill-based or experience-based, so educational level, geographic distribution, specific professional skills or experiences, and then international experience. And so we actually find that so 68% of the co-ops that practice representative democracy say that they are planning to kind of recruit for specific professional skills or experience in the next 3 years. There are some other questions that also get at that. I'd be happy to have a kind of a longer conversation about those items.
All right, well, we unfortunately are at the end of our time. There's so many good questions. There's like 40 questions in here that we haven't answered, that we weren't able to get to, but I want to respect everyone's time, and we're just a minute from the hour. So thank you so much again, NCBA, for hosting this webinar. Thank you to all of you who joined for your great questions. I've seen the chat being very active. I haven't obviously been able to pay any attention to it for the last few minutes, but we really look forward to diving into that and hearing the feedback that you have so far. And if you are interested in staying connected to this project, you can sign up. If you go to the Cougary webpage, there you are. To learn more about Cougary and to subscribe for updates. We really do not send very many emails, I promise you. But if you're interested in receiving updates specific to this project, please go sign up. And we will be keeping those who sign up informed of how the project is unfolding. And again, thank you all for being here and for your interest in this work. It's been a pleasure to share just these sort of some early findings with you. So any final word, Laura?
Just to say that this recording will go out to everyone as well as the slides, and feel free to email us. I monitor that email address, and we're happy to engage with folks who are interested in this data.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Be well.
Thank you guys. Bye.
Thank you.